The Nexus station hung in the cold emptiness of space like a metal flower blooming at the intersection of 12 major trade routes. And within its massive rotating rings, over 1,000 different species walked and crawled and slithered through corridors that never knew true darkness or true silence. Merchants from the inner worlds haggled with miners from the asteroid belts, while diplomats from ancient empires pretended not to notice the smugglers conducting business in the lower levels. And through it all, the station's security forces maintained a careful illusion of order that everyone knew was just a polite fiction. In the shadows of a derelict docking arm on level 47, something watched the crowds with the patient hunger of a creature that had perfection killing into an art form. Across 10,000 years of evolution, his name was Sethrak, and he belonged to a species called the Vrethkai. The Vrethkai stood nearly 3 meters tall when they chose to rise to their full height, though Sethrak preferred to keep himself compressed and low, his segmented body folding in ways that made him look smaller and less threatening to the untrained eye. His exoskeleton was the color of dried blood, and it could shift its pigmentation to match almost any surface, a gift from ancestors who had hunted across the rust-colored plains of a world that no longer existed. 4 arms ending in hands that could crush metal or perform surgery with equal precision hung at his sides, and his compound eyes, each one containing over 40,000 individual lenses, processed the crowd before him with the cold efficiency of a targeting computer. Sethrak was a hunter, and Nexus Station was his hunting ground. He'd been doing this for 40 cycles now, moving from station to station across the galaxy, taking prey when the hunger demanded it and the opportunity presented itself. And in all that time, nothing had ever given him pause. The Vrethkai were apex predators in the truest sense of the term, and the civilized galaxy had simply never produced anything capable of challenging that position. Other species had their weapons and their security systems and their laws, but the Vrethkai had something far more dangerous. They had millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had turned them into perfect killing machines, and no amount of technology could replace instincts honed across countless generations of survival. Sethraks' venom glands pulsed gently beneath his mandibles as he watched a group of Kellian traders flutter past on their delicate wing membranes, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with the nervous energy that marked them as perpetual prey animals. Too many of them, he decided, and too public a location. The Kellians traveled in flocks for a reason, and while Sethrak could certainly kill 1 or 2 before the others escaped, the screaming would draw attention he did not want. He shifted his compound eyes to a cluster of Moravian merchants setting up a stall near the water recycling station, their gelatinous bodies quivering with the stress of being so far from their homeworld's warm oceans. The Moravians were soft and slow, and their fear scent was already thick in the recycled air. But they were also valuable enough that their disappearance would trigger an investigation. Sethrak was patient, and patience meant being selective. He continued his scan, his hunting protocols running through assessments so fast that his conscious mind barely registered them, cataloging every potential target by species and size and social connection and likelihood of being missed. A pair of Gren maintenance workers shuffled past with their heads down and their shoulders hunched in the universal posture of beings who had learned that invisibility was survival. And Sethrak dismissed them as well. The Gren were technically protected by the station's labor contracts, and killing one would mean dealing with the bureaucratic nightmare of the workers' coalition. The minutes stretched into an hour, and Sethrak remained motionless in his hiding spot, his body temperature dropping to match the ambient air until he was nearly invisible to thermal sensors. This was what separated a true predator from a mere killer: the willingness to wait, to watch, to let the perfect moment come rather than forcing an imperfect one. And then he saw it, and then Small creature emerged from a side corridor, barely a meter tall, with soft brown fur and large dark eyes that blinked against the station's artificial lighting, a Pelori. The Pelori were rodent-like beings from a gentle world of endless grasslands, and they had entered galactic society as traders and craftsmen, their nimble fingers and keen eyes making them excellent workers in precision industries. They were also, without exception, the most timid species Sethrak had ever encountered. This particular Pelori was clearly lost, its whiskers twitching with anxiety as it looked around at the unfamiliar surroundings of level 47, its small hands clutching a data tablet that probably contained shipping manifests or inventory lists or some other mundane business concern. It had become separated from its trade caravan. Sethrak could see the faded logo on its vest marking it as a member of the Pelori Merchant Collective, and now it was wandering alone through a section of the station where few legitimate businesses operated. Perfect. The Pelori's screams were pitched too high for most species to hear. Their disappearances were rarely investigated with any real effort, and their bodies were small enough to dispose of easily in any of the dozens of waste processing units scattered throughout the lower levels. Sethrak felt his hunting protocols lock onto the target with a satisfaction that bordered on pleasure. He began his approach, flowing from shadow to shadow with a grace that belied his massive size, his exoskeleton shifting colors to match the grimy walls and flickering advertisements that lined the corridor. His venom glands began producing the paralytic compound that would freeze the Pelori's muscles while keeping its pain receptors fully active. The Vrethkai did not believe in quick deaths, after all, and the terror of prey was half the satisfaction of the hunt. 30 meters separated him from his target, then 20, then 15, and then something happened that Sethrak had not experienced in 40 cycles of hunting: his threat detection. Cortex screamed a warning so loud and so urgent that it stopped him mid-stride, every hunting instinct he possessed slamming into reverse with a violence that left him momentarily disoriented. Something was wrong. Something was here. Something was watching him with the same cold patience that he had been using to watch his prey, and whatever it was, Sethrak's most primitive instincts were telling him that he had just made a terrible mistake. His compound eyes swept the area with frantic precision, searching for the source of the danger that his body had detected before his mind could process it. And for a long moment, he saw nothing but the usual station. Traffic merchants and workers and travelers, going about their business with no awareness of the monster lurking in their midst. And then he found it, leaning against a support strut about 20 meters away, arms crossed over its chest, watching the same Pelori with an expression of casual interest. Was a creature that Sethrak had heard stories about, but had never actually seen in person. A human, and in that moment, Sethrak understood that he was no longer the most dangerous thing on level 47. Sethrak held himself perfectly still in the shadows, his compound eyes fixed on the human with an intensity that would have terrified any other species in the galaxy. The human did not seem terrified at all. It was a female, Sethrak noted, though with humans it was sometimes difficult to tell without closer examination. They lacked the obvious physical differences that marked gender in most species, and their clothing and grooming habits seemed to follow no logical pattern whatsoever. She was dressed in the practical coveralls of a cargo handler, the fabric worn at the knees and elbows in a way that spoke of actual labor rather than fashion, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a simple knot that kept it out of her eyes. Those eyes were the first thing that struck Sethrak as dangerous. They were brown, an unremarkable color that could be found in 1,000 species across the galaxy. But there was something in the way they moved that set his threat detection cortex buzzing with renewed warnings. Human eyes were forward-facing, like the eyes of every predator species Sethrak had ever encountered. And they tracked motion with a precision that suggested millions of years of hunting experience encoded into every nerve. The human was watching the pelori with what appeared to be casual concern, the kind of expression one might wear when noticing a lost child in a crowded marketplace. But Sethrak's instincts told him that she was aware of far more than just a small furry creature wandering through the corridor. She knew he was there. She had to. No, there was no other explanation for the warning. Signals flooding his nervous system. No other reason for the ancient fear that was coiling in his gut like a living thing trying to escape. Sethrak had spent 40 cycles hunting sentient beings across dozens of worlds and hundreds of stations. And he had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Those instincts had kept him alive when faster or stronger or smarter predators had failed. And right now, those instincts were telling him that he had wandered into another predator's territory. The human shifted her weight slightly, a movement so subtle that most species would not have noticed it at all. And Sethrak felt his venom glands retract involuntarily. She had positioned herself between him and the pelorit. Could have been coincidence. The station was crowded, and people moved constantly, adjusting their positions for comfort or convenience, or simply because standing in one place too long made their legs ache. But Sethrak did not believe in coincidence. He believed in predators and prey and the eternal dance between them. And he recognized the human's movement for what it was, a challenge. She was claiming the pelori as her own, not to hunt it, but to protect it. And she was doing so without saying a single word or making a single aggressive gesture. This was what made humans so terrifying to those species who had learned to recognize them for what they truly were. They did not need to threaten because they did not need to prove anything to anyone. Sethrak's mind raced through his options with the cold calculation of a hunter, assessing a difficult situation, weighing risks and rewards with the same precision he had used to. Select the pelori as a target in the first place was faster than a human. Every speed comparison in the galactic databases confirmed this beyond any doubt. And Sethrak had personally clocked his striking speed at nearly twice what a human could achieve. He was stronger than a human. His forearms could generate enough force to crush the bones of species far more durable than the soft pink creatures from Earth. And his exoskeleton could shrug off blows that would kill most organic beings. He was venomous. And humans had no natural resistance to the paralytic compounds his glands produced, which meant a single scratch would leave this female helpless and screaming while he finished his business with the Perstis Peloribi. Every objective measure, Sethrak should have felt confident in his ability to handle this situation. He did not feel confident at all. Something about the way the human stood there, completely relaxed, arms still crossed, face wearing an expression that might have been boredom or might have been something far more dangerous. Something about all of it made Sethrak's threat detection cortex howl warnings that he could not ignore. He had heard stories about humans from other Vrethkai, whispered tales shared in the dark places where his kind gathered to trade information and boast about their kills. Humans were persistent predators, they said, a concept so alien to the Vrethkai way of thinking that Sethrak had initially dismissed it as exaggeration or myth. The Vrethkai were ambush hunters. They struck fast and hard and deadly, overwhelming their prey with speed and venom before it could react. And the idea of hunting any other way seemed inefficient to the point of absurdity. But humans did not hunt like the Vrethkai. Humans chose their prey, and then they followed it, walking when it ran, resting when it rested, tracking it across distances that would exhaust any other species in the galaxy. They did not need to be faster than their prey, because they did not need to catch it in a sprint. They simply needed to keep walking until the prey's heart gave out. from terror and exhaustion, and then they would eat it while it lay gasping on the ground. Too broken to even scream, the humans called this persistence hunting, and they had used it to become the dominant predator on a planet so hostile that the Galactic classification system had labeled it a Category 4 death world. Earth was a nightmare of extreme temperatures and toxic atmospheres and megafauna that would have sent the Vrethkai running for shelter. And humans had not merely survived there, they had conquered it, driving every other apex predator into extinction or submission through nothing more than their refusal to stop coming. And now those same humans had spread across the galaxy, bringing their terrifying patience and their pack-hunting instincts and their utter inability to accept defeat to every corner of civilized space. The human female was still watching the Pelori, but Sethrak knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that she was also watching him. She was waiting to see what he would do. She was waiting the way a human waited for prey, with the calm assurance of a predator who knew that time was always on her side. Sethrak found himself taking a step backward before he consciously decided to do so, his body responding to the ancient wisdom of survival that said some fights were not worth winning because winning them would cost more than losing them would save. The Pelori had noticed the human now, its large dark eyes blinking up at her with the confused gratitude of a prey animal that did not understand why a predator was being kind to it. And the human smiled. It was a small expression, barely a curl of the lips, but something about it made Sethrak's ichor run cold in his veins. Smile was not for the Pelorith, smile was for him, and it said, without words, that the human knew exactly what he was and exactly what he had been planning to do. And she found the entire situation amusing in a way that suggested she had already decided how this encounter would end. Sethrak's mind reached into the deep archives of Vrethkai knowledge, pulling up everything his species had ever learned about the creatures called humans. And what he found there did nothing to calm the ancient fear that was spreading through his nervous system like a slow poison. The humans had arrived on the galactic scene barely 300 years ago, a blink of an eye compared to species like the Vrethkai, who had been hunting the stars for millennia. And in that short time they had established themselves as one of the most successful and most feared species in known space. They were not the strongest species. Dozens of races could match or exceed human physical capabilities, including the Vrethkai themselves. They were not the smartest species. Their technology, while impressive, was largely borrowed or adapted from older civilizations who had been building starships when humans were still living in caves. They were not even the most numerous species. Their population spread thin across colonies and stations and ships that could never quite keep up with their endless appetite for expansion. But they were something that no other species in the galaxy had ever managed to be. They were terrifying. Sethrak's compound eyes flickered through the data streams flowing across his internal displays, processing information about human biology and psychology and behavior patterns with the desperate focus of a prey animal trying to understand what was hunting it. Human endurance exceeded that of every other known species by a factor of 3. They could walk for days without rest, run for hours without stopping, and their bodies could recover from injuries that would kill most organic beings within weeks or sometimes even days. Their senses were unremarkable by galactic standards, but their pattern recognition abilities were so advanced that they could detect threats from the smallest details. A broken twig, a displaced shadow, a scent that did not belong. They were omnivores, capable of eating almost anything organic and quite a few things that were not, which meant they could survive in environments that would starve more specialized species into extinction. And they had something that the Vrethkai had never evolved, something that the galactic databases struggled to translate into terms that made sense to non-human minds. They had pack loyalty, The Vrethkai were solitary hunters, coming together only to mate and then separating to pursue their individual hunts across the endless void of space. This was the natural way of apex predators, who did not need the protection of numbers and could not afford to share their kills with competitors. Humans were different. Humans formed bonds with each other that defied logic and self-interest. Bonds so strong that they would die to protect members of their pack, even when there was no biological advantage to doing so. They extended these bonds beyond their own species, forming attachments to other beings too. Pets and livestock, and sometimes even to wild animals that any sensible creature would have killed and eaten. The Pelori that Sethrak had been hunting was not part of this human's pack by any reasonable definition, but something in the way the human stood suggested that she had decided to protect it anyway, simply because it was small and frightened and alone. This was madness to a Vrethkai mind, a waste of energy and resources that evolution should have purged from the human genome long before they ever reached the stars. But it was also why no sane predator in the galaxy hunted humans anymore. Because when you hurt a human, when you killed one of their pack members, the others came for you. Not just the ones who knew the victim personally, but all of them humans you had never met. Humans who lived on worlds you had never visited. Humans who had no connection to your crime except the simple fact that you had harmed one of their kind. They called it justice, and they pursued it with the same relentless patience they had once used to chase prey across the African savannah. Sethrak had heard stories of Vrethkai, hunters who had made the mistake of targeting humans, who had thought their speed and venom and millennia of evolution would protect them from consequences. Those hunters were gone now, erased so completely that not even their names remained in the archives. The humans had not sent armies to hunt them down. Humans rarely bothered with armies when dealing with individual threats. They had simply put out the word that a Vrethkai had killed one of their own, and then they had waited. Some of the hunters had been caught by human bounty trackers who specialized in the kind of relentless pursuit that humans called their birthright. Others had been betrayed by informants who feared human retribution more than they feared Vrethkai venom. A few had simply vanished, their ships found drifting and empty in the void, with no sign of what had happened except for the unmistakable evidence of human presence in their final moments. The galaxy had learned a simple lesson that Sethrak was now remembering with painful clarity. Humans looked after their own, and they had a very broad definition of who counted as their own. The female in front of him had not spoken a word since Sethrak first noticed her, had not made any threatening moves or drawn any weapons, had not done anything at all except stand there, with her arms crossed and that small knowing smile on her face, but she did not need to do anything more. Her presence alone was a message that Sethrak was receiving loud and clear. A message that his threat detection cortex was translating into the most basic language of survival. This prey is claimed, and you do not want to find out what happens if you challenge that claim. Sethrak thought about the paralytic venom in his glands, thought about the speed of his striking limbs, thought about all the advantages that should have made him the dominant predator in this encounter. And then he thought about what would happen if he attacked this human and failed to kill her. She would survive humans, survive things that should have killed them with a regularity that bordered on the supernatural. Their stubborn biology refusing to accept death, even when death was clearly the only logical outcome. And if she survived, she would tell other humans what had happened. Word would spread through the human networks that connected every station and colony and ship in the galaxy, spreading faster than any Vrethkai could run, reaching places he had never been and people he had never met. His description would be shared, his hunting patterns analyzed, his likely destinations predicted with the terrifying accuracy of a species that had spent millions of years learning to track prey across impossible distances. He would become the hunted instead of the hunter, and he would spend the rest of his shortened life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the moment when a human finally caught up with him. It might take years, it might take decades, but it would happen, because humans never stopped coming. Never. Sethrak looked at the small Pelori that had been his chosen prey just minutes ago, watched it blink its large dark eyes at the human female with confused gratitude, and he felt something he had not experienced since he was a hatchling on the training grounds of his homeworld. He felt like prey. The moment stretched between them like a wire pulled tight enough to sing, and Sethrak found himself frozen in a way that had nothing to do with physical paralysis and everything to do with the ancient calculus of survival that every predator carried in their bones. The human had not moved from her position against the support strut, had not changed her relaxed posture or uncrossed her arms, had not done anything at all that could be interpreted as aggression or threat or even interest. But she was watching him now. Her brown eyes had shifted from the Pelori to the shadows where Sethrak lurked. And even though he knew that human vision was poor compared to his own compound lenses, even though the darkness should have hidden him completely from her inferior sight, he could feel her gaze on him like a physical weight. She could see him. He did not know how. Perhaps she had noticed the slight shimmer of his camouflage adjusting to the changing light. Perhaps she had caught the nearly inaudible whisper of his claws on the metal floor. Perhaps she simply had the predator's instinct for knowing when something dangerous was nearby. However she had done it, she knew exactly where he was, and she was making sure that he knew she knew. This was the part that the galactic databases had struggled to explain, the part that other Vrethkai had tried to describe in whispered conversations that always seemed to circle back to the same inadequate words. Humans were aware in a way that transcended simple sentience. Every spacefaring species was sentient. That was practically a requirement for developing the technology needed to reach the stars. But sentience was not the same as the bone-deep hunters. Awareness that humans carried with them. Like a second skin, the Kellians were sentient, but they lived their lives as prey. Their awareness focused on escape routes and hiding places, and the endless vigilance of creatures who knew they were being hunted. The Moravians were sentient, but they had evolved on a world without predators, and their awareness was soft and slow and easily overwhelmed by the harsh realities of galactic life. Even the Vrethkai, for all their millions of years as apex predators, had an awareness that was essentially reactive. They noticed things because their hunting instincts flagged them as important, not because they were actively searching for threats in every shadow and every silence. Humans were different. Humans looked at the universe and saw a place full of things that might want to kill them, and they responded to this knowledge not with fear but with the calm readiness of a species that had been fighting for survival since before they had learned to walk upright. The human female was demonstrating this awareness now, her attention fixed on Sethrak with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating a potential rival, and he found himself unable to look away. Even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, she tilted her head slightly, a gesture that Sethrak's translation cortex identified as a human expression of curiosity or challenge. And then she did something that made his threat detection systems spike to levels he had not experienced since his training days on the homeworld. She uncrossed her arms. The movement was slow and deliberate, giving Sethrak plenty of time to see that she was not reaching for a weapon or preparing to attack. Her hands came to rest at her sides, fingers loose and relaxed, in a posture that any prey species in the galaxy would have read as non-threatening. But Sethrak was not a prey species, and he recognized the posture for what it was, a fighting stance so confident that it did not need to look like a fighting stance. The human was telling him, without words, that she was ready for whatever he might do. She was telling him that she had been ready from the moment she first noticed him. Skulking in the shadows, she was telling him that she had already calculated how this encounter would end, and she was so certain of the outcome that she felt no need to prepare or defend or even tense her muscles in anticipation of violence. This was the thing that made humans so terrifying to those who understood them properly, not their endurance, or their pack loyalty, or their refusal to stay dead, but their absolute and unshakable confidence in their own ability to handle whatever the universe threw at them. They were not arrogant, not in the way that young Vrethkai hunters were arrogant before they learned that the galaxy contained things that could kill them. Humans were simply certain, in a way that went deeper than thought, that they would find a way to survive. They had evolved on a death world, surrounded by predators and parasites and natural disasters that should have wiped them out 1,000 times over. And they had not just survived, they had thrived. They had conquered. They had spread across every continent of their homeworld, and then reached for the stars with the same relentless determination that had carried them through ice ages and plagues and wars that had killed millions. That evolutionary history was written in every fiber of this human's being, in the calm steadiness of her breathing and the relaxed readiness of her posture, and the small smile that still played at the corners of her mouth. She was not afraid of Sethrak. Should have been afraid. He was a Vrethkai, an apex predator from a species that had been hunting the stars for millennia before humans had discovered fire. But she was not afraid, because fear was not something that came naturally to a creature whose ancestors had looked at saber-toothed cats and decided to fight them with pointed sticks. Sethrak felt his resolve wavering in a way that it had never wavered before. The certainty that had carried him through 40 cycles of successful hunts, crumbling under the weight of this human's quiet confidence. He could attack her right now, close the distance between them in a fraction of a second, and bury his venom claws in her soft pink flesh before she could react. Was almost certain he would succeed, almost, but that small margin of uncertainty, that tiny possibility that she might be faster or smarter or simply luckier than his calculations suggested, was enough to give him pause, because if he attacked and failed, if this human survived and told her story to other humans, Sethrak would become something that no Vrethkai ever wanted to be. He would become prey. The Ewan's smile widened just a fraction, as if she could read the calculations running through his mind and found them amusing. And Sethrak realized with a chill that she had been doing her own calculations this entire time. She had seen him the moment he started stalking the Pelori, had watched him creep through the shadows with his venom glands primed and his claws extended. And she had chosen to do nothing. She had let him get close enough to strike, let him commit himself to the hunt, let him put himself in a position where retreat would feel like defeat and attack would feel like suicide. And now she was waiting to see which choice he would make, watching him with the patient curiosity of a predator who knew that time was always on her side. The Pelori had wandered closer to the human during this silent confrontation, drawn by some instinct that recognized safety, even if it did not understand the source. And now it stood almost directly behind her legs, its small nose twitching as it looked up at the creature that had unknowingly saved its life. Sethrak looked at the human, and the human looked at Sethrak, and between them passed a communication that needed no words and no translation. You can try. Her eyes seemed to say, but you will not like what happens next. Or the first time in 40 cycles, Sethrak chose to retreat. The decision came not as a conscious thought, but as a movement, his body responding to the ancient wisdom of survival before his mind could interfere with calculations of pride, or honor, or the reputation he had built across decades of successful hunts. He took a step backward, then another. His compound eyes remained fixed on the human as he moved, watching for any sign that she might interpret his retreat as weakness and decide to press her advantage. But she did nothing except stand there, with her arms at her sides and that small knowing smile on her face. She was letting him go. This realization should have felt like relief. And perhaps somewhere deep in his primitive brain, there was something that resembled gratitude for being allowed to walk away with his life intact. But mostly what Sethrak felt was a cold and unfamiliar sensation that took him several seconds to identify Shang. He was the hunter, the apex predator, the evolved perfection of millions of years of natural selection that has stripped away everything except the ability to kill and survive. And he was backing away from a single human female who had not even drawn a weapon or raised her voice. The shame burned in him like acid, eating at the foundations of his identity. But it was not enough to make him turn around and attack. Nothing was enough to make him do that, because shame, however painful, was something that could be survived and eventually overcome. While the consequences of attacking this human would follow him for the rest of his life, which would almost certainly be much shorter than he had previously expected, Sethrak continued his retreat, moving slowly and carefully through the shadows, maintaining the fiction that he was simply a traveler passing through this section of the station, a stranger with no interest in the small Pelori or the human who had claimed it as her own. The human watched him go, her brown eyes tracking his movement, with the lazy attention of a predator who had already decided that this particular threat was no longer worth her full focus. She did not follow him. She did not call out to station security or alert other humans to his presence or do any of the things that a prey species would have done to ensure their safety from a potential threat. She simply watched and waited and let him leave, because she knew, just as Sethrak knew, that the threat had already been neutralized, not through violence or confrontation, but through the simple demonstration of what violence and confrontation would cost. When Sethrak reached the corridor that led to the docking bays, he allowed himself one final look back at the scene he was leaving behind. The human had turned her attention back to the Pelori, crouching down to bring herself closer to the small creature's eye level. And even from this distance, Sethrak could hear the soft sound of her voice as she spoke to it. "Hey there, little guy," she was saying, the words carrying through the recycled air with a gentleness that seemed impossible coming from a creature that Sethrak now recognized as one of the most dangerous beings he had ever encountered. "Are you lost? Do you need help finding your people?" The Pelori chittered something in response, its fear scent fading as the human's calm demeanor worked its strange magic on the prey animal's nervous system. And the human laughed, an actual laugh, warm and genuine, and completely at odds with the cold killer that Sethrak had seen lurking behind those brown eyes. "Come on then," she said, straightening up and gesturing for the Pelori to follow her. "The merchant collective usually sets up near the main trading floor. I'll walk you there. Make sure you don't get lost again." The Pelori fell into step beside her, its short legs hurrying to keep pace with her longer stride. And together they walked away from level 47 toward the safer and more populated sections of the station. Neither of them looked back. Neither of them seemed to remember that a monster had been lurking in the shadows just minutes ago, ready to kill and feed and disappear into the vast, uncaring void of space. The human had moved on with her life, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a brief interruption in her day that did not deserve any further thought or attention. And perhaps, for her, that was exactly what it had been. Sethrak turned and made his way to his ship, his claws clicking against the metal floor in a rhythm that felt different somehow, less confident, less certain of his place in the galaxy's great hierarchy of predators and prey. His vessel was a small courier craft, unremarkable in every way, designed to be forgotten the moment it passed out of sight. The perfect vehicle for a hunter who did not want to be remembered. He boarded without incident, sealed the airlock behind him, and initiated the departure sequence with hands that trembled. Just slightly as they entered the commands, the Nexus station fell away beneath him as his ship rose through the docking bay and out into the cold emptiness of space. And Sethrak watched it shrink on his view screen until it was nothing more than a point of light. Among millions of other points of light, he had come to this station as a hunter, confident in his abilities and his place in the universe. And he was leaving as something else entirely, something smaller, something humbler, something that had learned a lesson about the true nature of the galactic food chain. There were predators in the galaxy, and there were prey, and then there were humans who looked like prey but were not, who seemed soft and slow and fragile but were none of those things, who had clawed their way up from the mud of a death world through nothing but stubborn refusal to die, and had brought that same stubborn refusal with them to the stars. Sethrak plotted a course for the outer rim, far from the trade routes where humans traveled, and the stations where humans gathered, and the colonies where humans built their strange pack-bonded communities. He would find new hunting grounds, prey that did not come with the protection of a species that held grudges across generations and pursued justice across light years. He would survive, because survival was what the Vrethkai did best. Even if that survival meant accepting that there were monsters in the galaxy more dangerous than himself, behind him, growing smaller with every passing second. Nexus Station continued its eternal dance at the intersection of 12 trade routes, its corridors filled with 1,000 species going about their business in blissful ignorance of the dramas that played out in the shadows. The Pelori merchant would rejoin its caravan, never knowing how close it had come to becoming another forgotten victim in the lower levels. The human female would continue her work as a cargo handler, her heroism unrecognized, because she did not see it as heroism at all, just the natural behavior of a species that had learned long ago that protecting the weak was the foundation of true strength, and Sethrak would carry the memory of this encounter for the rest of his long life, a reminder that the universe was bigger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and that even apex predators could find themselves outmatched by creatures they had dismissed as soft. The stars wheeled around his ship as it accelerated toward the outer rim, and somewhere in the distance, a human laughed at a joke told by a small furry creature with large dark eyes, completely unaware that she had just become a legend that Vrethkai hunters would whisper about for generations to come. The galaxy was vast and full of terrors, but the greatest terror of all walked on 2 legs and smiled at the darkness, and the darkness, for once, looked away first.